Imagine digging through a prehistoric cave and finding a pile of human bones. The skulls are broken, the long bones are cracked open, and across the surface are tiny cuts made by stone tools, the same kinds of marks hunters left on butchered animals. Someone did this carefully. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. But were they eating enemies, relatives, or simply trying to survive? The uncomfortable answer is that ancient humans did eat other humans. Not once, not in one place, and not always for the same reason. But before we label our ancestors monsters, we need to understand what the evidence actually proves. Because a cut mark on a human bone does not automatically mean dinner. Bodies can be cut during burial rituals. Enemies can be mutilated after death. Flesh can be removed without being eaten. Archaeologists therefore look for a whole pattern. They look for cuts where muscles attach. They look for joints that were deliberately separated. They look for long bones smashed while still fresh, usually to reach the fatty marrow inside. They look for burning human tooth marks, and whether human remains were processed and discarded like animal bones. One clue is interesting. Several clues together become an archaeological crime scene. An even older clue comes from Kenya. A roughly 1.45 million-year-old hominin shin bone carries 9 marks that closely match cuts made by stone tools. Their position is consistent with removing muscle, but researchers cannot identify either species involved or prove that flesh was eaten. So it remains a clue, not a conviction. And one of the oldest convincing crime scenes comes from Gran Dolina in northern Spain. Around 800,000 years ago, a human species called Homo antecessor lived there. Inside the cave, researchers found the remains of multiple individuals, including children and adolescents. Their bones carried cut marks, impact damage, and breakage patterns similar to the animals butchered at the same site. The bodies were not placed carefully in graves. They were processed. The most disturbing possibility is that these were not members of the local group who died naturally. Some researchers argue they may have been outsiders, people captured, killed, and eaten during conflict. In other words, cannibalism may have been less like a desperate meal and more like prehistoric territorial violence, a message written in bone. But even that does not explain every site. Move forward hundreds of thousands of years, and Neanderthals enter the story. At Moula-Guercy cave in France, archaeologists found the remains of at least 6 Neanderthals. The bodies had been skinned, dismembered, defleshed, and broken apart. Marrow-rich bones were smashed. Bones without useful marrow were treated differently. Human remains and deer remains were processed in strikingly similar ways. That looks a lot like food preparation. But why Neanderthals ate these individuals is still debated. One explanation is starvation. A collapsing environment could have pushed a group toward the most extreme available food source. But other researchers argue the evidence for a famine at the site is not strong enough. And that matters, because if food scarcity was not the cause, then the act may have involved conflict, culture, or both. This is the problem with prehistoric cannibalism. The bones can show us what happened to a body. They rarely tell us what the people believed while doing it. Then we reach Gough's cave in England, roughly 14,700 years ago. And here, the story becomes even stranger. The people using this cave hunted animals such as horses and deer. They were not surrounded by an empty landscape with nothing to eat. Yet human bodies were intensively processed. Soft tissue was removed, bones were chewed, long bones were cracked for marrow and grease. But several skulls were treated with extraordinary care. The faces and skull bases were removed. The edges were carefully shaped. The finished objects became human skull cups. That is not the fastest way to reach the brain. It is the slow way, the deliberate way, the symbolic way. One human arm bone was even filleted, chewed, engraved with a zigzag design, and then broken open. At this point, hunger alone stops making sense. The best interpretation is that eating the dead formed part of a funerary ritual. Perhaps it honored relatives, perhaps it kept the dead physically inside the community. Perhaps the skull cups carried memory, identity, or power. We do not know, and anyone who claims certainty is selling a cleaner story than archaeology can support. But we do know that burial is not the only way humans have treated the dead. Some cultures bury bodies, some burn them, some preserve them, and some may have consumed them. To modern viewers, that sounds horrifying. To the people performing the ritual, abandoning a body in the ground may have sounded equally strange. Cannibalism also had a practical side. Human bodies contain calories, protein, fat, and nutrient-rich marrow. But humans are not especially efficient prey. A person provides less meat than a large deer, horse, or mammoth while creating far more danger. Humans fight back. Their relatives retaliate, and hunting members of your own species can destroy alliances that took generations to build. So routine cannibalism probably did not spread simply because humans were convenient food. They were not. The behavior required another pressure strong enough to overcome fear, risk, disgust, and social cost. That pressure might be starvation, it might be warfare, it might be ritual, and sometimes it may have been all three. There was also a hidden biological danger. Eating members of your own species makes it easier for certain diseases to cross between bodies. Much later, evidence shows that consuming infected human nervous tissue can spread kuru, a fatal prion disease. Ancient humans did not understand proteins or infection, but groups that repeatedly became sick after consuming the dead could still learn the pattern, not through laboratories, through memory, through fear, through rules passed from one generation to the next. That may be one reason cannibalism became one of humanity's strongest taboos. A taboo is often culture doing the job of science before anyone knows the mechanism. So, did ancient humans eat other humans? Yes. The evidence is too widespread and too detailed to dismiss. Human bodies were cut with stone tools, joints were separated, flesh was removed, bones were smashed for marrow. Some remains were chewed. But the word cannibalism hides several completely different behaviors. A starving family consuming the dead to survive is not the same as warriors consuming an enemy, and neither is the same as a community ritually transforming a loved one into food, memory, and sacred objects. The act may look identical after thousands of years. The meaning may have been completely different. That is the real lesson buried in these bones. Ancient humans were not mindless savages doing random, horrifying things. They made decisions inside systems of survival, loyalty, violence, grief, and belief. Systems that were different from ours, but not entirely unfamiliar. Because the most disturbing part of prehistoric cannibalism is not that ancient humans were monsters. It is that they were human. And under enough hunger, fear, hatred, or love, humans have always been capable of turning the unthinkable into something necessary, meaningful, or sacred.